there's a strange shift that starts happening around midlife. You begin to speak less, not because you have nothing to say, but because words start to feel heavy. What once felt urgent to explain now feels unnecessary. What once begged to be defended now slips into silence. Conversations you once would have entered with energy now feel like noise. The need to correct, to clarify, to convince begins to dissolve. And yet, you feel more than ever. Freud might say the unconscious is becoming conscious. That the defenses of youth, noise, urgency, reaction, are being replaced by something deeper. By awareness. By stillness. By an inner honesty that no longer requires validation. It's not that life got quieter. It's that your inner world got louder. You begin to hear yourself in ways you never could before. Not your voice, but your being. Your intuition. Your deeper knowing. You start to notice pauses in conversation, and you respect them. You no longer feel the need to fill every silence. You listen, not just with ears, but with presence. You notice how people say things they don't mean. How they mask pain with laughter. Or avoid truth with small talk. And instead of interrupting, you observe. Gently. Silently. With compassion. This isn't detachment. It's refinement. Because the older you grow, the more sacred your energy becomes. You begin to understand that words are not always the most honest part of communication. Presence is. Tone is. Intention is. And in many spaces, your presence alone speaks louder than anything you could say. You no longer need to explain yourself. Not because you've given up, but because you've accepted that not everyone is meant to understand you. And that's okay. Your truth is not diminished by someone else's misunderstanding. You no longer speak to be agreed with. You speak when it serves peace, not when it feeds drama. You start noticing the cost of wasted words. How often you once talked to fill space, to avoid discomfort, to please others, to smooth things over. And now, silence feels kinder. There is clarity in quiet. There is strength in restraint. You don't have to respond to everything. You don't have to justify how you feel. You don't have to argue to stay true to yourself. This is the quiet that begins in midlife. And it's not a fading, it's a returning. To yourself. You feel more because you are no longer performing. You are no longer filtering every thought through the lens of someone else's comfort. You are simply being. The shift is subtle but profound. You no longer react. You respond. You no longer compete. You collaborate, or you walk away. You no longer shrink. You simply don't explain your expansion. And in this stillness, emotions grow richer. You cry more easily, not from weakness, but from the beauty of it all. A song, a sunset, a memory that once hurt but now brings gratitude. You feel other people's pain without carrying it. You feel your own truth without resisting it. You feel your body as a home, not a project. This quiet is not passive. It is alive, intentional, intimate. It's the softening of the need to fix. It's the release of the need to control. It's the maturity of knowing when to speak and when silence says more. Freud wrote of layers, of consciousness and repression, of desire and denial. And maybe what happens as we age is that the layers become thinner, less guarded, more integrated. You stop running from yourself. You stop running from the truth. And in that stillness, you find power. Not loud power, not aggressive power, but grounded power. The kind that doesn't shake when someone disagrees. The kind that doesn't need applause to feel seen. The kind that walks into a room and simply is. You begin to understand that real communication doesn't require volume. It requires resonance. And sometimes the most resonant thing you can offer is stillness. You might find yourself in a conversation and notice the urge to defend, to explain, to win. And then you don't. You breathe. You soften. You let go. And nothing collapses. Nothing is lost. Only your anxiety about being misunderstood. You don't need to win anymore. You need to feel peace. And that changes everything. You begin to treasure your energy. You guard it like a garden. You know who can enter and who cannot. Not from bitterness, but from wisdom. You become more discerning. You speak to those who listen with their hearts. You open to those who have earned your trust. You express, but only when the expression feels aligned. This quiet is not disconnection. Is deeper connection to yourself, to what matters, to the moments that used to rush past you unnoticed. You savor more. You slow down. You choose silence not to punish, but to protect. You begin to feel life more fully. The grief beneath a goodbye. The sacredness of a shared glance. The miracle of waking up to your own breath. And in this softening, in this slowing, in this rich, resonant quiet, you are not losing your voice. You are finally hearing it. This is not about becoming invisible. This is about becoming undeniable. Because the woman who speaks less, but feels more, knows exactly who she is. And that knowing needs no defense, no permission, no noise, only truth, only presence, only peace. As you grow older, the language you speak begins to change. Not in accent or tone or vocabulary, but in texture, in depth, in honesty. You begin to speak less with your mouth and more with your presence. You say fewer things, but feel them more. What once required paragraphs now requires only a glance. What once needed explanation now needs only to be lived. You begin to realize that the truest parts of you, the aching, the longing, the soft, sacred knowing, have never needed to be spoken to be real. They live in how you touch a hand, how you hold eye contact just a moment longer, how you nod when someone speaks of loss, not to fix it but to honor it. Feeling becomes your fluency. And in a world addicted to talking, that can feel strange, even lonely. People ask if you're okay. They worry about your quiet. But they don't see the symphony inside you, the intricate, emotional awareness dancing behind your stillness. Freud believed that the most powerful feelings are often unspoken. That repression hides what the conscious mind is not yet ready to face. But with age, and with courage, those feelings no longer need to hide. You begin to let yourself feel things you once silenced. You sit with old grief instead of pushing it away. You allow anger to move through you, not as fire, but as cleansing. You cry, sometimes for no reason at all. But really, the reason is everything. The years you held your breath. The words you never got to say. The roles you played, perfectly and painfully. Now those feelings rise. Not to drown you, but to free you. You feel more, because you are no longer numbing. No longer pretending. No longer running from your own heart. And the more you feel, the less you need to say. Because feeling, real feeling, is its own expression. You find yourself connecting with people in quieter ways. Through shared space. Through shared silence. Through a shared look that says, I know. You notice the subtleties in others, too. The tremble in a friend's voice. The hesitation in their laugh. The way they avoid certain words or speak too quickly over their own pain. And you don't interrupt. You stay. You feel it with them. That is your new language, presence. And it says more than advice ever could. You no longer need to fill silence to be kind. You no longer need to offer solutions to be supportive. You offer yourself, your being, your feeling heart. And slowly, the people around you begin to feel safer in your presence. Not because you solve their problems, but because you don't run from their truth. And because you finally stopped running from your own. There's power in that. You used to believe power meant being heard. Now you understand true power is being. Being in your truth. Being in your body. Being in your feeling. Even when it's messy. Even when it's quiet. Even when no one claps. You begin to reframe your story, not in grand declarations, but in silent revelations. You read a passage that brings you to tears. You hear a piece of music that unlocks a memory. You wake in the night with a single sentence in your heart, and it is enough to change everything. This is the language of the second half of life. Not louder, not bolder, but truer. And in this language, you begin to write yourself anew. You say yes only when you mean it. You say no without apology. You offer your truth without pretense. And you start to feel safe in your own skin. Freud might say that the ego softens here, not in weakness, but in wholeness. That your psyche no longer needs masks to survive. That your unconscious is no longer in hiding, but walking beside you. And you welcome her. The past versions of yourself. The child who felt too much. The woman who buried her needs. The self who waited so long to be seen. You see her now. You feel her now. And you let her speak. Through sensation, through tears, through the quiet ways you honor her every day. This is not regression. This is reclamation. The reclaiming of your emotional self. The one you tucked away to stay strong, to keep the peace, to survive. She is back. And she doesn't need to say much. Because her feeling says everything. You find that life becomes more poetic, more symbolic, more soulful. You read between the lines. You dream in deeper colors. You sense meaning in moments that once felt mundane. A breeze becomes a message. A bird at your window feels like a blessing. A quiet morning becomes a sanctuary. Because you're no longer moving so fast. You are no longer talking over your life. You are living it, feeling it, and listening to it speak to you. This is the language you now speak. And it may not be loud, but it is full. It is tender. It is sacred. It is you. There is a kind of heaviness that doesn't come from what we carry, but from what we hear. The noise, the constant commentary, the endless expectations, the pressure to respond, to engage, to participate in every passing moment. As you age, you begin to realize much of this noise was never yours to begin with. The opinions, the advice, the criticism disguised as concern, the social rituals, the shallow conversations, the voices that told you what a good woman should be, what aging means, how silence is dangerous. You start to see how you were shaped, not always by love, but by volume. The loudest expectations often drowned out your inner voice. And now, in this chapter of life, you are unlearning all of it. You begin to walk away from places where noise is mistaken for connection. You begin to retreat from spaces where your soul must shrink to make others comfortable. And in that withdrawal, you do not feel lost. You feel lighter. Because the noise of comparison, of judgment, of hurry, was never meant to define you. Freud might say this is the return of the repressed self. The quiet self, buried under years of performance and pleasing. And now, as the outer voices lose their grip, the inner voice starts to rise. She does not shout. She whispers. She says, you are allowed to choose peace. And so you begin to. You stop engaging in arguments that lead nowhere. You stop explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop answering calls that drain your spirit, not out of cruelty, but out of reverence for your own mind, your own energy, your own soul. You begin to notice the difference between connection and noise. Some conversations leave you empty. Others leave you full. You start to trust that. And so, your circle becomes smaller. Your rituals become quieter. Your presence becomes more focused. You turn off the television more often. You choose nature over news, books over gossip, moments over memories shared too loudly by people who never asked how you felt inside them. This is not isolation. This is refinement. You are not removing yourself from the world. You are removing the world from within you, at least the parts that never belonged. There's a sacred weight to this silence, not a burden, but of meaning. Because when the noise subsides, you begin to hear what truly matters. The sound of your own breath, the beat of your own heart, the whisper of your own knowing. And it is so gentle, so trustworthy, so steady. You realize that noise often came from fear, your own and others. The fear of being forgotten, the fear of being irrelevant, the fear of being alone. But now you meet solitude not as a threat, but as a gift. Because in solitude, your soul is no longer interrupted. And in silence, your truth no longer has to compete. You begin to ask different questions. Not how do I look, but how do I feel? Not do they like me, but do I respect myself? Not am I still relevant, but am I still real? And the answers come, quietly, powerfully, from within. You start making decisions not from noise, but from clarity. You start dressing not for others' eyes, but for your own pleasure. You begin to measure success not by applause, but by peace. This is the freedom that comes when you stop letting noise narrate your worth. You don't need the loud praise. You don't need the echo of constant attention. You don't need to be talked about to know that you matter. You know, and that knowing is quiet. And that quiet is enough. Sometimes you sit in your living room with a cup of tea and feel more connected than in a crowded room. Sometimes a bird outside your window says more to your heart than 1,000 conversations. Because connection is not about sound. It's about resonance. And you are finally resonating with your truth. You no longer chase what is loud. You no longer perform what is expected. You no longer fear what others think of your quiet. Because your quiet has become your strength. And in that quiet, the only voices that remain are the ones that speak with love. This is the weight of noise, how it once shaped you. And this is the gift of silence, how it now sets you free. At some point, without realizing when, you begin to answer to yourself. Not to trends. Not to your past. Not to what others think you should be. To yourself. This is the quiet revolution of aging. Not a rebellion against the world, but a reunion with your own soul. The voices that once shaped you, parents, teachers, bosses, lovers, begin to fade. Not with resentment, but with distance. And in their place, your own voice grows louder. Not louder in volume, but in weight, in truth. In clarity, Freud might say the superego, the inherited voice of culture and family, begins to release its grip. And in its place, a more integrated self emerges. You begin to trust your own timing, your own knowing, your own sense of what feels right. You no longer seek permission to rest. You rest. You no longer need a reason to say no. No is enough. You begin to feel what you want, and you allow yourself to want it. Not with guilt, but with grace. Because for the first time, you realize that your desires were never selfish. They were signals. You begin to recognize how often you've betrayed your own inner authority to avoid discomfort, to keep the peace, to belong. And now, you begin to belong to yourself. You notice the small betrayals, the conversations where you held back, the smiles you gave when your heart ached, the plans you made out of duty, not desire. You feel them now, not as shame, but as signposts. Your body remembers the cost of abandoning your truth. So you return to honesty, to alignment, to boundaries that don't need to be explained. You no longer tolerate what drains you. You no longer ignore what inspires you. And this too is a kind of speech. A quiet declaration, I know who I am now. You may not say those words out loud, but your choices speak them every day. You move differently. You love differently. You even pray differently, not as a plea, but as a conversation. You speak to life itself, to the divine within, and you listen. There's an intimacy now between your inner world and the world around you. You sense when something is meant for you, and when it's not. You feel drawn to people who match your calm, not your chaos. You begin to build a life that reflects you. Not the you were expected to be, but the you that's been waiting all along to be welcomed. You begin to mother yourself. You begin to mentor yourself. You begin to meet yourself with kindness. You do not punish the years that were lost. You honor the woman who survived them. And in that honoring, something blooms. You no longer ask, what should I do? You ask, what do I know deep down? And you trust that. You don't rush clarity. You let it rise gently. You don't prove your value. You embody it. You may still speak, still share, still express. But now your words are rooted. Now your voice comes from a place that doesn't need to be validated. Because you have already said yes to yourself. You have already chosen your own soul. And that dear one is the highest authority there is. With age, you begin to understand, not everything that comes to mind needs to be said. You learn the beauty of restraint, not as silence imposed, but as clarity chosen. It's not that you have less to say. It's that you have more to preserve. Your peace, your energy, your truth. Once, you may have felt the need to respond to everything, to defend yourself, to educate, to correct every wrong assumption. But now you pause. And in that pause, something sacred lives. You feel the rising urge to react, and you breathe instead. You sense the tension in a conversation, and you choose not to escalate. You notice a moment when your old self would have spoken, and your new self stays still. Not from fear, but from power. Because now you know, some things are not worth your voice. Some battles are not worth your peace. This is not giving up. This is growing up. Freud might call it sublimation, a redirection of energy from reaction to purpose. A maturity of emotion, a channeling of intensity into intention. You begin to feel the difference between noise and necessity. You sense which conversations are sacred and which are simply echoes. You start to honor the effort it takes to speak. You understand that every word carries energy, and you choose where yours goes. You notice how often others speak to fill silence, to avoid themselves, to be seen. And you no longer need to be seen to be valid. You know who you are, even in quiet. So you save your voice. For truth, for tenderness, for beauty. You use words to build, not to defend. To reveal, not to control. To connect, not to dominate. And when words no longer serve, you let them go. You choose a gesture instead. A pause. A presence. And that presence speaks volumes. You begin to see restraint not as suppression, but as discernment. The wisdom to know what belongs to you and what doesn't. You no longer carry arguments in your head for days. You no longer replay conversations wishing you'd said more. You feel the moment pass and you let it go. Because your peace matters more than being right. And that's not weakness. That's wisdom. You realize the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more depth, more listening, more pauses between the words. So you become the pause, the still point in a spinning world, the calm breath in a storm. And people begin to feel that. They may not understand why they feel safe around you, why your silence feels softer than others' words. But you have turned restraint into refuge. Your quiet is not absence, it's essence. It's the strength to stay soft. It's the power to remain centered. It's the discipline to keep your voice sacred. And that, dear one, is the voice the world needs most. Not louder, but clearer. Not quicker, but wiser. Not always heard, but always whole. In the end, what remains isn't what you said. It's what you radiated. And by now, presence is everything. Not the kind of presence that needs an entrance or an audience, but the quiet, rooted presence of a woman who has come home to herself. Freud might say this is the integration of the self, the merging of shadow and light, of feeling and thought, of the unconscious and conscious into something whole. And you simply feel like yourself. Finally, you no longer seek to be impressive. You seek to be real. And realness is magnetic. You enter a room and people sense something. A calm, a depth, a steadiness. You no longer rush to speak, yet your silence carries weight. You no longer over-explain, yet your eyes say everything. You have become the message. Because now you live what you once tried to prove. You embody what you once tried to explain. You are no longer a voice trying to be heard in the crowd. You are the space others enter to hear their own truth. And this is not ego. It's energy. The energy of a woman who has faced herself and stayed. Who has felt her feelings and softened. Who has let go of the need to be anything but present. You are no longer searching. You are arriving. Every day. Every moment. You find joy in the smallest things now. The way light lands on the table. The way your breath fills your body. The quiet warmth of your own hand. You're not trying to escape yourself anymore. You're learning to savor who you've become. You carry years inside you, but they don't weigh you down. They lift you. They've taught you the rhythm of letting go. They've taught you the difference between noise and music. And now you live like a song. Not loud, but unforgettable. Not flashy, but full. Not perfect, but true. You understand now that presence is a form of healing. That being fully with someone, even in silence, is sacred. That being fully with yourself is the root of all connection. So you become a space, a pause, a sanctuary, and those who meet you here feel it. They may not say it, they may not know what it is, but they leave changed, because you have allowed yourself to be changed. Not by time, but by truth. Not by fear, but by depth. Not by what the world wanted, but by what your soul needed. You no longer narrate your worth. You embody it. You no longer audition for love. You remember that you are love. You no longer perform peace. You radiate it. And in that quiet radiance, you give others permission to stop performing too. This is the power of your presence. Not the words you say, but the truth you carry. Not the applause you receive, but the peace you've made. Not what you're doing, but who you are when you're simply being. So sit with yourself, in the morning sun, with a hand on your heart, and whisper, I am here. And that is enough. Because it is. You are, and you always have been. If this spoke to something quiet inside you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Not just to follow, but to keep returning to spaces that remind you who you truly are. And if you feel called, share your voice in the comments. Because sometimes, even a few honest words can help another woman feel seen. You are not invisible. You are deeply felt, especially here.